Let's see. Question is did this thing actually go live? It's not show. Yep, here we go. Slight delay. There we are. Just make sure my. There we go. All right, we're good. Welcome everyone to another session of Consulting Growth Insights Live. And I'm pretty pumped to have this conversation. I got Marcel Pettipas here with me from Parakeeto. Excuse me. And Marcel is a profitability expert, or at least Marcel, I'm calling you the profitability expert. And we're going to have a conversation about profitability today, which in times of quote unquote great uncertainty becomes more and more and more important, which is kind of what we're all living through right now in the space. So Marcel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we have to reschedule this once. I've been pretty excited to have the chat, and we're finally here. So I'm going to kind of set this up a little bit, and then we'll just dive in. So more and more recently, the conversations I'm having with boutique consulting firm founders and partners tend to focus on profitability. And I would say that's, for me, that's been more of a completely recent trend. I mean, I've always focused there, but more recently, I'm having more and more of these folks asking me like, hey, we want to tackle positioning because we think that'll help us be more profitable. Like they're even thinking that way, which is usually the direction that I take things. And a couple of things I'm seeing in the market are the firms that tend to be the most profitable tend to be private equity backed. It's not a 100% rule in terms of like every single private equity firm is profitable. And also doesn't mean that every single private firm is not, but generally that's what I tend to see. They specifically tend to have the highest gross margins from what I've seen. And they seem to do better with managing, like the cost of goods, labor, and things like that. But for them, and I'm kind of setting the stage about kind of all the stuff we're maybe going to talk about. For the private equity firms, what I'm seeing is they tend to struggle with the growth side of things. Even though private equity forces both growth and margin, the firms themselves tend to struggle on how to achieve both of those goals. On the flip side, in the private firms, the more the focus tends to be on the growth and margin kind of tends to be forgotten. And I think a good place to start is maybe chatting about why is that? What's happening there in these two kind of broad scenarios? And then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, an excellent frame. And of course, speaking to this moment in time that we find ourselves in, I think everybody would agree that the economy is at best uncertain right now. I think most would argue a bit difficult right now. So new business, maybe not as flush as it once was. Client contracts not necessarily closing as quickly as they once did. Renewals and all of those kinds of things maybe not happening to the degree that they were before. So we're really talking about profitability in the context where firms are having to really face the reality of what does it mean to protect profit in a time where we can't sell ourselves out of the problems that we have typically sold ourselves out of in the past. So to your point, why is it that private equity backed firms might be more profitable than non-private equity backed firms? And how do we manage this sort of tension between growth and profitability? And so I want to zoom out and first talk about sort of three different levels of profitability that I don't think are talked about individually enough, but that are distinct and important for their own reasons. The first level is what we call at Parakeeto direct delivery margin. And if you have a finance background, as I explain this, you might think, oh, that sounds a lot like contribution margin or maybe some lens on gross margin. But the idea behind that metric is really understanding what is the profitability of a unit of work that we sell. And so in your firm, that could be a client, it could be a project, it could be an engagement, it could be a retainer, it could be a service line, whatever that is. But a unit of work, what is the fundamental profitability of that thing in the sense of what do we get paid that actually belongs to us relative to what it costs us to get that work done, ignoring things like overhead, unutilized time, indirect delivery expenses, etc. And this is a really important concept because if you were to think about this like in a manufacturing capacity, it's the difference between like what is the profit margin on like a chocolate bar theoretically versus what is the gross margin on the entire function of making chocolate bars after we take into account that we have the capacity to produce 1 million a month, but we're only actually selling 500,000 a month, and that we had half of our line down for 4 days last month for maintenance, and like those are costs that are going to influence the gross margin of the business, but that shouldn't affect and constantly fluctuate our understanding of how fundamentally profitable is this product in a fairly isolated context. And it's important to understand that because that is sort of the foundation for everything, right? If we're not selling a product or a service at a rate that allows us to have enough margin to absorb the indirect costs and then make the decisions that we want to make with regards to how much we want to invest in growth versus allow to flow to the bottom line, then nothing else really matters. There's no amount of execution that will enable the business to change course. Whereas if we have confidence that that number is good, we can make decisions about investing in our capacity so we can grow faster, investing in overhead so we can grow faster, and not have good gross margins as a business and not have good net margins as a business, but still be making those decisions very deliberately and very confidently and with the optionality to turn that profit on whenever we choose to, right? So that, if nothing else, just the knowledge that we have fundamentally good direct delivery margins is a very important basis for all of the thinking that we're going to work through here in the rest of this answer. So I'll pause there in case you have some commentary, but that's sort of the first big idea is when you sell something, do you know how fundamentally profitable that thing is when you isolate for just what goes into it versus what you get paid?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely talk to you from an experience perspective, having when I was running the prior iteration of my agency, that was an unlock for me because I'm not never came from a finance background. I technically disliked it for a good period of time, etc. Right, but one thing I'll say is, both from personal experience and what I've seen with clients, is not having a good understanding of that prevents you from being able to even think about like what decisions you could make,
Right.
because not having a good handle on it hides where the real problems potentially are.
100%.
Because
And
you
I
might be
think
thinking, oh, I've got a overhead problem, and yeah, maybe that's part of it. But what you might not realize is, well, you actually have a major delivery profitability issue, and that's what's actually causing it. And maybe that delivery profitability issue, because you're so inefficient, is why you need the extra overhead for management and whatever, because they're trying to micromanage. All this kind of stuff starts coming into play, right?
totally. And this is where, and there's other vectors that this concept exists at, but this is one of the first places that you could look to say, is the problem execution or is the problem that we are planning to fail? And there's a lot of firms that spend so much time trying to get a little better at project management and a little better at scope management, get a little more efficient at getting things done without realizing that it's like that's all wasted effort, because the fundamental problem is every time they sell something, they set themselves up for failure and they
Yeah.
just aren't aware of it. So step one, and first big idea is your thing fundamentally profitable? And I think this is where the importance of the work that you do, Michael, is really evident, because there's two sides to that coin. You can either charge more for a similar scope of work, and a lot of that's going to come down to how you're positioned and the story you tell and the expertise that you have. And I would argue that most people in consulting or creative disciplines, their skill set is better tuned to going down that path to increase their direct delivery margin than the other option, which is efficiency, trying to get more efficient than the next person in terms of the time that goes in and or the cost of that time or the type of labor that you're able to engage. And of course, if you can do both, that's great. And this is why I think a lot of PE firms do well. They tend to have both of those skill sets internally. So that's the first big idea, is making sure you have that direct delivery margin dialed.
There's an interesting question that just came in, Marcel. I'm
Sure,
looking
yeah.
at the LinkedIn chat. So, question is, when looking at these profitability margins, how do you identify where the main bottleneck is? And also, how do you identify which fundamental unit to pick when making this calculation?
Yeah,
That's an interesting question, because this gets us into like, well, is it hourly? Is it deliverable? Is it whatever, right? And then
yeah.
what's causing it? I've got my thoughts, but you're the expert here, so.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this as well. So, um, the question of like, what is the main bottleneck? Well, I think that's getting to like, is it that we're not charging enough, or is it that we're not efficient enough? And so, I think the question around which of those two things is the bottleneck requires context, and it requires you to have some kind of an understanding of a couple of different things. Number one, what kind of competitive landscape that you exist in. And this is an interesting thing about positioning, is you can change your positioning and your competitive landscape changes completely, right? Where you used to compete against these people for this customer, now you're competing against different people for a different customer, and that might change the price sensitivity side of that equation quite a bit. And then of course you have to consider who you're selling to and what the actual value of what you do is to them. And it's very possible that you're in a situation where you're charging as much or more than you could reasonably charge for this thing, and you actually just have to turn to the efficiency side of the equation and say, we just need to get more efficient at delivering this thing. And so I think you just have to kind of take into account, like, first place to look, is there an opportunity to increase what we charge for this thing? That should always be step one. And that might not be easy, but ideally that there's opportunities for that. And if you find that you're not able to do that, then it's pretty clear that you need to figure out efficiency. And if you can't figure out either of those things, then you probably need to find a new business to run, because that is the entire game of business, is creating these very lopsided value equations where you can deliver an outsized amount of value relative to what it costs you to do it. That's the whole game that we're in. And then the fundamental unit, that really comes down to like what it is that you sell. And so I would start by doing this just at kind of a broad level. And then if you do have a multitude of different services or products, I do think it's a valuable exercise to do the quick math to say, okay, we usually sell it for this. It usually takes us this much time, therefore this much cost to do this thing. And you can start to evaluate it that way. And then when it comes to pricing, the equation is the same no matter what you sell, whether it's a fixed fee for the project, whether it's a unit of time, the math is always the same. It's what do we get paid minus our cost to deliver divided by what we get paid. So for an hour, that might be, let's say, $200 an hour minus our $50 an hour cost divided by $200 equals whatever percentage that is. And if it was a project, it might be $20,000 minus $5,000 of cost divided by 20,000 equals whatever the margin is. So the formula is the same regardless of what unit you pick. And that would be, specific to your firm. But I'd encourage you to look at the different things that you sell, because I think that would be an interesting insight. You might find that there's like one thing you do that's really profitable and a few other things that are not.
Yeah, so my thoughts on this are, I completely agree with everything, and probably in a similar boat, but I maybe approach it from a slightly different angle, which is, I'll kind of tell you from experience, and especially recent conversations I've had. Almost every single firm I talk to is probably pricing lower than they should, and it's because most of their positioning is anchored to, it's like a better or best type positioning versus something more differentiated or unique. So they're always stuck being anchored to what other people are doing and pricing and whatever. Kind of, to a certain extent, basic kind of category design thing, but even just more simply, like if you are selling what's considered a more commodity type service, like, well, we're management consultants for whatever industry, and that's all that is your positioning, then you are automatically going to be anchored to whatever other management consultants for that industry are charging, and you've got no other option because that's what you're compared. That's one thought that comes to mind. The other one is kind of sort of to what you were talking about, like the two levers. I think my my question always is, when clients kind of talk about this with me, it's, well, could you charge more? Like, how do you usually pitch this? And oftentimes it's like, oh, well, we're, you know, purposely or not, a lot of times the pitch is, well, we're offering, big four quality at not big four prices. Like, oh, great, you just created yourself a ceiling.
Yep.
Right. So it's like a lot of this is sort of, I look at it more as like from a psychology perspective, more than even just the numbers. Like, I feel like it's the numbers sort of flow oftentimes from how they are thinking about it. Even if the possibility is completely there for it to be a very profitable service line.
Yeah. Now, I think it's worth taking a moment to double click on why that happens, and maybe take the side of like, well, what is legitimate about that strategy?
Yeah.
I think that there's not enough like conscious thinking that goes into this. So, why would it make sense to intentionally position yourself in a competitive market and position yourself against like big four accounting firms?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reason for that is an understood category with existing demand, and you can run PPC ads and people will search for exactly the thing that you're selling, and they will click through and they will get on your website. And so like that is the benefit, of course, of stepping into a commoditized market with demand, is it's typically easier to find clients, but you are competing often on price, on these like minor incremental differentiation pieces. And so you do have to be much better at operations. But the idea there is that should allow you to get to scale, because you're tapping into a whole bunch of existing demand. And I think that not enough founders that have positioned themselves that way have connected the dots to say, my business strategy is to tap into this existing demand so I can get really big. I think that there's a lot of people that want to run a boutique profitable firm that are doing that, not realizing that it's sort of contrary to the outcomes that they want in their business. And so that would be the argument for saying, let's get off of that beaten path and sort of put ourselves in a category of one, or do this sort of radically differentiated positioning, which has challenges because now we're having to often educate clients and take a different approach to going to market. However, to your point, can create significant differences in terms of what we can charge for a similar scope.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and it brings up a couple of conversations I've had recently with folks that are pretty much exactly there, where they're doing just that. Like, well, I'm looking to build a boutique firm that I could sell in whatever 5 years, but they're approaching it as a, hey, I'm going to build the next whatever 1,000-person accounting advisory firm. It's like those things don't match, or vice versa too. I see it the other way where they go, well, I'm going to go really, 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 really niche, and I'm going to get all kind of crazy with this, which is not a bad strategy necessarily. But if your goal is to whatever, be $100 million firm in 3 years or whatever it is, that's not the way to get there usually. Not these days, at least.
The other thing that's interesting about that is we think about exit paths. I know we're going to get back. Don't worry, we're going to get back to the other two levels of profitability, but I think this is an interesting thread. When you think about exit values, those are also quite different from a strategy perspective. Like building a big firm in an existing category, you're going to usually have a pretty low EBITDA multiple, but it'll be fairly easy to sell that business in a sense, especially if it's at a scale, $1 million plus in EBITDA, where it could be seen as a platform for like a PE firm, or it can be seen as like a tuck-in for an existing firm. And then on the other side, you could have a much smaller firm, but that sells at a much higher multiple because there's a strategic value to, like, let's imagine
it's a strategic acquisition at that point. Yeah.
Right. Because it's like, let's say I'm a big four consulting firm and I have this massive base of existing clients, and then I can go grab a company that has a 85% direct delivery margin on a highly specialized, highly skilled service. And I can start cross-selling that into my existing organization. That is so much easier than going to market in a blue ocean category that, maybe the wave hasn't fully crested yet and the timing's off, but like there's a synergistic outcome there that could justify a completely different story. And maybe put two firms that have radically different levels of scale at similar levels, actually, in terms of valuation. It's a totally different approach, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider as well, just in terms of exit.
Yeah, one last thing I'll mention here before we get completely off track. I'll bring us back afterwards, which is on the positioning side of things. I think there's kind of an in-between strategy, if you will. So there's the, hey, we're going to create a new category of consulting, whatever, which I honestly, that's not really I don't tend to go that way. I think that's Is it possible? Sure. Are there edge cases you can do it where it makes sense? Yes. Is that what most firms should do? I highly do not believe so. And which is why, kind of from a positioning perspective, what I work with clients on is the positioning is based on your unique IP and kind of ideas in that existing market. So you're niched down, not necessarily just based on industry or whatnot, even though that's not necessarily an awful thing to do. Um, but it's the way you approach the problem is your positioning, the frameworks, the methodologies, etc. And that changes the game where you kind of sort of have a little bit of the best of both worlds, where you have enough scale and existing demand. It's just that demand, you're giving them a reason to go, yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but you're still solving the problem that I have. Versus, oh, there's this completely new category that I don't even understand what this is. So,
I wish I had listened to that advice 7 years ago, Mike, because I think I just recently, and we've had this conversation, but like candidly, I've recently been having this existential realization of like,
yeah,
I've spent 7 years trying to create a new category without raising like tens of millions of dollars, which, might have made it more feasible, when probably the right move would have been to just like start an accounting firm and then do what we've been doing, as opposed to like trying to start to do the brand new thing. And then now, we're
yeah,
finding ourselves in this position where we're like, oh, maybe we should just sell people what they want to buy first and then give them what they actually need.
yeah, yeah. There's a conversation you and I think need to have, maybe separately at some point or whatnot. But yeah, um, for sure. So let's get back on track there. So we have three
Yep.
levels of profitability. We talked about one. There's two more.
Yep. Right. So level one is that direct delivery margin. So when I sell something, what does it cost me to deliver it? Is that healthy? And generally, just in terms of benchmarks, like we want to see that be above 70% when you sell something. And ideally, you're landing at a similar level when you measure it on the other end of completion. The next level is what we would call delivery margin. And if you have a finance background, you might think of this as being gross margin. And the idea there is when we look at the entire function of doing client work in the organization, and we take into account some of the indirect costs like unutilized time, like indirect delivery expenses, such as the software licenses that you pay for, maybe the proprietary database of customer insights or whatever that you subscribe to. When you take into those things, which are generally going to make up at least 10, often closer to 20 or 25% of your income are going to go to those things, then you want to basically have that be at about 50% or higher. So in other words, when you look at your profit and loss statement at the end of a month or a quarter or a year, you'll have a certain amount of income. Ideally, you've stripped out money that wasn't yours and passed through you. So you have a certain amount of income that's yours. And ideally, you won't have spent more than 50% of that income to actually like run the whole function in the business that does the work. And that, again, is a place where you might have really strong margins or you might have poor margins, but we can start to tell a really quick story here of if I have really good direct delivery margins. So I know when I sell something, it could be very profitable. And then I don't have great gross margins on the P&L. Well, that tells me that I either have a lot of unutilized time or a lot of indirect delivery expenses or both. And again, that might be a choice. You might say, hey, it's a really hard market to get talent in, or it takes us a really long time to ramp people up because what we do is super specialized. And as an owner, if you have confidence that what you sell is fundamentally profitable and you can differentiate those things, you might make the decision to say, I'm going to be overstaffed for a little while because I have confidence that we're going to grow into that. And if you're PE backed, you probably just won't get to make that decision because they're going to be like, no, you have to be militantly disciplined. And that's why often they're more profitable. They just like force you to do the thing that's objectively right. But that's like the second level that's really important. And you want to know that you can get to at least a 50% gross margin or gross margin or delivery margin on the P&L. Ideally, you can get that up to 60, 65, 70%. And essentially, the higher that number is, the more optionality you have to then get to
Yeah,
the third level of profitability, which is the bottom line. So if we assume that you're going to spend anywhere from 20 to 30% of your income on overhead, ultimately, if you land at 50% gross margin on the P&L and then 30% goes to overhead, you can expect to have 20% as the bottom line. And then that's what you get to choose to either take out or reinvest into more sales and marketing, more admin so you can grow faster, maybe more staff, right? So poor gross margins so you can grow faster, or pull out. And if you're at 60% spending 30, you have 30% to play with. If you're at 70% spending 30, you're at 40%. So the TLDR here is the higher your gross margin on the P&L, the more choices you have. And the more confidence you can have when you make deliberate decisions to perhaps be less profitable, because you know that you have the foundation to be able to pull back on those investments and get to profitability if you choose to.
Yes, yeah, so a couple of things come to mind when you bring those things up. One is early on in your answer, you mentioned hiring, and you didn't directly mention, but like hiring strategy. That's again something I see very often is founders don't, for some reason, they tend to not connect the dots amongst all of these things in terms of like, hey, let's assume we have the business strategy and we're going to go, it doesn't matter which way to decide to go, whether it's the broad market demand thing or the more niche thing or whatever, right? But there are implications to hiring strategy needed to support that positioning, which impacts the potential margin, which impacts the pricing you need to do, which impacts all of these things are very much interrelated. And I tend to find that people haven't really thought about all those different interactions. And then kind of going back to some of the early question about bottlenecks, like mapping these things out, because for some people, again, they just don't think that way, but mapping out like, okay, this impacts this, which impacts this, which impacts this, which impacts this other thing that we started with. It's a bit circular, and that kind of can help you identify where the potential bottlenecks honestly are. Because I've seen that too, where it's like, oh, well, we had this plan and we had this margin target, and in theory we should have gotten there, but why are we not getting there? Oh, we're hiring people that are more expensive than we thought they would be because the market changed, or because we realized that the more junior people that we originally thought wouldn't work, but we haven't really connected those dots or whatever. Or it goes the other way, which is, whatever, you get the point.
And just to speak to like why I think that is, there's sort of two, maybe three reasons that I think that that's really problematic. The first is that arriving at that framework on the surface is simple, right? It's like what you charge, how much capacity you have, what you charge for that capacity, what, that capacity costs. So like it seems, well, it is simple. But when you start to double click on those things, it gets really complicated really fast, right? So I mean, you've been there, you've worked through this, and I'm sure people listening to this have worked through this. It's like, okay, well, what exactly is our capacity, and what's a cost per hour? What's included in that? What's not included in that? How do we think about utilization, and actually like doing all of the specific math that connects these dots in a way that is consistent is actually really quite difficult. And so I've seen a lot of firms where they had a model that they were making all of their decisions based on, and they came to me and they had this exact story of like, we thought we were on track and our P&L is very, very different. What's going on? And I'm like, oh, the way you're calculating utilization is pulling out this capacity, which means that there's like a 15% discrepancy between what's in your model and what's in your P&L. That's all your profit. It's gone now. And that was just because your math wasn't right. But they didn't realize it. So that's part one, is like having a framework for this. And for better or for worse, we've just made our entire framework available at no cost. So I'd encourage people to go check that out. You can grab it in the toolkit that's on our website. But that
definitely check it out. I've used your resources in the past. They're pretty amazing. So
yeah, and we just try to make this stuff available because that just shouldn't happen. But that's part one, is like the math is hard. Therefore, building the model is hard. And therefore, either you never get to the point of having built a model, or the risk is you build a model that's flawed, and then you're making decisions based on information that's not accurate. And so I think that's part of the reason that people struggle with this so much. And then I think the third piece is, let's say you do cobble together a model, it's often a little too janky to actually be practical when you need it. So when you're making the decision about letting someone go, or hiring someone, or negotiating on their salary that's higher, or staffing, this project with different people than you had originally planned to, often the way that this math gets done is so disjointed and clunky and disconnected that you don't have the time to really be objective about it. And so it ends up being gut-based decisions. And then 6 months go by and you have the company offsite and you finally get an afternoon together to go back and look at all this stuff, and you realize, oh shit, we made a lot of decisions that we shouldn't have made.
Yep. I've been there. So yep. Level 3. What do we have for level 3?
Yeah, so I've kind of talked about, level 1 was direct delivery margin, level 2 was gross margin, and then level 3 is net margin, right? So like, what are you actually taking home? And so I'll circle back to that, but I think the big idea there is, if you have strong direct delivery margins and strong gross margins, the bottom line is a choice. How much of a bottom line you have is a choice, right? That should be happening
Mhm.
for you and not to you. I think a lot of firm owners are struggling with net profit, and that tends to be all they pay attention to. And a lot of times what that means is
Mhm.
they think that they have an overhead problem just because everything above net profit is considered OPEX and overhead. I could tell you that very few firms that we've looked at, and we've looked at a lot of firms over the last 7 years, almost none of them have actually had an overhead problem. They had a gross margin problem, which was either a function of they weren't charging enough for what they were doing, or they had utilization challenges. That's basically all that it came down to. And so I think that's sort of the big message is the bottom line is it's the goal, but it's actually kind of the least
Mhm.
important measure in a lot of ways. And the best tool that you can give yourself to feel like you have control over the bottom line in the business is having strong direct delivery margins and delivery margins. And then you can start to make these decisions of should we reinvest in growth? Should we have more profit? That can change over time, and you can just like flex that to whatever is aligned to your desires at that time. And the higher that gross margin is, the less you actually have to decide between those two things, the more optionality you'll have. And the big idea here is, the rule of 40. If your growth rate and your profitability added together are 40% or more, you're doing pretty good by most objective measures.
Yep. So a couple, I want to dive into a few things maybe before we talk a little bit more about net margin and bottom line here.
Yeah.
So first is symptoms. Let's talk a little bit about the symptoms that exist so people can kind of self-diagnose.
Mm-hmm.
And let's go back to level one and then we'll go to level two. Like, what are the common symptoms that exist that people should be paying attention to kind of self-diagnose? Yep, we've got a direct delivery margin problem.
Mm-hmm.
That one's probably pretty straightforward, but like, a common one that I'll just throw out there, and I'm sure you have others, which is like, hey, are people? At least I think I'm thinking about this the right way. Like, are saying that they're like everyone's really busy. There's seemingly no capacity, no time left, but somehow we are just not hitting our targets.
Yeah.
What is going on?
That's the biggest one, right? Your
Yeah.
team tells you they're overworked. Your accountant tells you you're overstaffed. You're not sure who to believe. That tells
Yep.
you pretty right away, like you've got a direct delivery margin challenge. Or perhaps it's that every time it starts to feel like you can finally breathe from a cash flow perspective, the team starts to flare up again, and then you've got to roll your sleeves up and get into hero mode,
Mhm.
and then start to hire people, and you just feel like you can never escape that sort of cycle of every time we start to grow a little bit and it feels like everything's okay, the chaos starts again. So that
Yeah.
tells you pretty much right away you either need to charge more, get more efficient, but the fundamental margin of what you're selling is probably not where it needs to be.
Yep. Yep. Now, with that, let's talk. We kind of talked about potential levers, but I'd love to maybe dive into some real life examples. And we don't have to give names, obviously, of clients or whatnot. But like,
Yeah.
what are the potential ways to address this? And let's think about this more broadly than just, hey, this is the decision needs to be made. But in all of these cases, there's a change management component that I think is worthwhile discussing, because these are oftentimes difficult decisions for the founders and the partners.
Yeah. So ultimately, when we think about like delivery margin, there's effectively three levers that you can pull to influence that number. The first is your average billable rate, which is essentially for every hour of effort that your team spends doing client work, on average, how much revenue do you earn for that? And that should be the same formula. It should be normalized no matter what your pricing model is, whether you sell time materials or flat fees or value-based pricing or whatever, a combination of those things. And the two ways that you can improve that number, we've already talked about. You could charge more for a similar amount of scope, or you can spend less time to get that thing done. So that's sort of the first big piece. And of course, the scary but often big opportunity for a lot of firms is to charge more for what they do and do the hard work of, the positioning and all of the other things that help you actually create the leverage to do that. Um, and then the other side of that equation, of course, is to say, like, let's make the investments and have the discipline to adapt the way that we work to get more efficient and to deliver, the same type of value, the same types of outcomes in less time. Or, another often undervalued skill is being more discerning about what clients actually value. We've had this conversation a number of times internally. I'm sure lots of other firms have as well, where it's like, we spent an inordinate amount of time on this thing. What was the last client that even asked to see that? When was the last time a client even looked at this thing? Right. And we figure out, like, we're spending all of this time on the wrong thing that our clients don't value. What if we got rid of that and spent half of that time getting better at the thing that they really care about? And so sometimes it's more about actually just being more discerning about where effort is going, as opposed to just trying to get more efficient at everything that we're doing and assuming that everything we're doing is worth doing.
I really like that because I've been there as well, first of all. And then second of all, I think something that tends to happen often, this is kind of going back to the psychology side of things, is the people that start firms often have come from other bigger firms, and they sort of have the best practice way of doing things, right? And that's not to say that the firm that they came from did it poorly. It's just what they were doing might not make sense for your clients because you're targeting a different client base, or what makes sense for a bigger firm doesn't make sense for a boutique firm, and that's not what people are looking for, right? So I think just being willing to kind of go past best practices and sort of at least be willing to have a conversation, even if it's just with yourself, of it's okay to change things. On the flip side, I've made the other changes like, well, I know better. This doesn't make sense. We're just going to change all this stuff. And in reality, no, this actually made sense. Really,
Yeah.
when it comes to like team structures and like account managers, project manager, all this kind of stuff. Like I thought I knew better, and I didn't realistically in hindsight. But it is what it is at this point. But I do think that's a really valuable thing you bring up in terms of at least being willing to look at it objectively.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's just a question of saying, like, I know that if I spent an afternoon building a better template for this, or screwing around in Zapier for this thing, like, we could save a few hours of time on every engagement in perpetuity. And if you stop to do the math on that, a lot of times, like, that investment is worth doing. You get a pretty quick return on it,
Yeah.
especially in terms of like increasing your direct delivery margin. So
Yeah.
that's number one, average billable rate. That's first lever. Second lever is utilization. This one is so important. It's really paying attention to, we pay a team for a certain amount of capacity. What percentage of that capacity actually gets spent earning the average billable rate that I just talked about? And of course, the higher that percentage is, the more likely it is that you're going to be profitable. And so there's two sides to that coin. You can either decrease capacity. That's, basically a nice way to say you let people go, you right size the team to the amount of work that you have coming in if you're overstaffed. And a lot of companies are overstaffed, especially right now, when maybe they had a big growth year last year, or they grew a lot through COVID, and then things just haven't been the same since. And the other side of that equation, of course, is you try to sell enough work to keep your team busy. And the opportunity in this is, especially in a time of uncertainty right now, really trying to embrace elastic capacity, which is a fancy way to say freelancers and contractors. So you don't have to necessarily leave money on the table, which so many firm owners are incredibly afraid to do for whatever reason. You could still take advantage of those opportunities, but without having to take on all the risk of being, massively overstaffed when things don't necessarily go the way that you thought they would. And that can
Yeah.
have a massive impact on your profitability. So utilization is lever number two. That's how you would think about that metric.
Yeah, and I'd say the market is more and more ripe for taking advantage of that right now because whatever, if we were talking, say, 5 years ago, I think there was a lot more sensitivity from clients of like, well, are you doing the work? Are there subcontractors? Like there was stuff in MSAs that was in there. Like a lot of that stuff just isn't there anymore outside of like, large procurement and stuff like that. Then sure, you're still dealing with it. But even then they're mostly kind of used to it, I think. With just how the market has evolved with fractionals and with global talent and all sorts of stuff, right? So I think, again, going back to just being willing to at least objectively have these conversations and not assume that just because it didn't work 5 years ago, it's not going to work now. Go ahead. Go for it.
I was going to say, the other thing I'll say on this is it comes back to the point you made earlier about these things being interconnected. Sometimes it makes sense to pay a premium for a fractional person that will be 100% utilized because you only pay them when
Yeah.
you need them. In the short term, rather than have a lower average cost per hour, therefore a higher direct delivery margin, but be paying for a whole bunch of time that doesn't get used. Like, so you have to kind of think about that equation in a more nuanced way.
Yeah, I think again, kind of going back to the uh, psychology piece of it, I think there's a lot of this thought of like, oh well, like this has to be in house. Like there's this idea of like, well, this thing, well, this is our thing. It has to be in house. Where the reality is sometimes it doesn't, or at least parts of it might not need to be. Right. And it's like you can still develop the IP and have oversight and whatnot. Now, some of this then starts getting into, well, is this person really a contractor? And you've got to deal with all the tax consequences. I don't think we want to get into that conversation, but it's worth at least mentioning. Um, one other thing, kind of going back to something you said earlier about thinking about like, hey, investing in this thing, like sitting down for an afternoon or for a day or whatever it is to improve operations. I would say the other thing is the same thing is true for the ability to increase pricing, right? So sometimes, I mean, I have this conversation all the time where, people will say like, oh, well, I see this a lot in like, again, private equity backed boutique firms where it's partners who are doing BD and delivery and overseeing teams. And a common complaint, let's just say, is like, well, we don't have time to invest in developing tools or whatnot. I'm like, well, it's a lot easier now with AI and offshore talent or whatever. Like you might be able to do it faster and cheaper than you think if you just, shut yourself off for an afternoon and
Yeah.
try to figure that out. Right. It's just, I think we have these kind of, we'll call it baggage that we consistently carry. It's like, well, 2 years ago, this wasn't an option. Yeah, but this is not 2 years ago anymore. Um, One other thing I'm curious about are your thoughts. How much of the issues that you're seeing right now are due to poor forecasting? And specifically, what I mean by that is I think there's a lot of what you described, which is, hey, 22, 23, we're pretty good.
Yeah.
And at least the first half of 23, right? And then after that, things have been tough. The market's changed even more so lately in 25 or end of 24, early 25. And like, how much of it is just due to poor forecasting and like little to no time spent on scenario planning?
That's definitely part of it. I could tell you that a lot of firms struggle with forecasting. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is a lot of them are trying to do forecasting purely in a bottom up way, which is sort of how most people in a project management setting would do forecasting, where they take stuff, they break it into
Yeah.
tasks, they assign those tasks to individual people. And that's really good for project management. What it's not that useful for is the kind of thing that you have to often do as an executive team in a firm, which is sit back and say, what if one of these 10 things happens? Or what if one of the 100 combinations of these 10 things happening
Yeah.
together occur, and be able to kind of fluidly look through those things? Trying to do that in a bottom up system is often just like impossible and completely impractical. And so it doesn't really happen. And a lot of decisions then get made based on gut, which sort of plays into my second point, which is, let's imagine that we can solve that forecasting problem, and we maybe have a more top down approach that's more fluid, and we do have a decent sense of like what the possible outcomes are. The other problem is that I find a lot of firm owners are um, too optimistic, frankly, because you're
Yep.
always sort of operating in this world of things could go really good or they could go really bad, or they could kind of be in between. And oftentimes, I think too many firm owners make a decision based on, well, I think things are going to go well next quarter. Therefore, I'm going to hang on to this team member that would be pretty painful to let go of, or, I'm not going to cut this expense that like allows me to get my, Friday afternoons back so I can go play pickleball. And it's like, I understand all of those things. I've been in that position of feeling like I finally got out of a part of the business and then I had to go back to it. It really sucks. But I think this is, again, one of the reasons that PE firms do better, is because the PE person doesn't give a shit about your pickleball on Friday. They're looking at the spreadsheet, they have no emotions, and they're like, you need to cut this, you need to fire this person, and you will do it or you will be gone. And so there is some advantage to having a very unemotional sort of accountability, that you can't get away from. It's really hard. It is very hard to do that when you're the owner and you don't have that accountability to anyone but yourself. And there's a whole other side of like not paying ourselves seriously enough as firm owners, but that's a pattern, especially in the
Yeah.
creative firms that we work with.
This actually made me think about a specific situation. I had a conversation with a client yesterday about this, and it's not an uncommon conversation in the more, especially like the more technical consulting environments, like whether it be life sciences or regulatory or supply chain, like those types of uh, industries, if you will. What often happens is the initial project or the initial engagement is less profitable than the third, the fourth, the fifth engagement,
Right.
just based on most of these, for again, in the management consulting space, right? Because some things are productized, but for the most part, it's kind of custom to a certain extent. Even if it's modular, it doesn't get modular until later engagements, that type of thing. And what I think a lot of firms are facing now is their win rates were higher in 22, 21, 20, even early 23. So they were planning on, okay, well, if we can win higher this initial engagement, we'll be in a good spot in 23, 24, 25 with these ones. But the problem is they didn't win as much. So their deals are taking longer. So like their entire model is, for lack of a better word, fucked. And that's what I'm seeing a lot of. So I'm curious if you've seen that, and what, if anything, you advise to firms like that.
There's sort of another sinister thing that is sometimes happening in that case as well, Mike, which is that they're either doing cash-based accounting or they're doing a version of accrual that's basically just shitty cash accounting, which is like invoice-based revenue recognition. And so the fact that they were closing things consistently often created the illusion of profitability. And now that there's not as much consistency there, what they're having to face is the music of actually your direct delivery margins were never that good, but you just had enough cash flow from new stuff coming in that it was helping make up for the sins of the stuff that was not that profitable.
Talk more about that. I mean, I've heard you talk about it, and I get it, but I think maybe for the listener who's maybe uninitiated, talk more about, maybe, I don't know if you can like use a scenario like more specifically.
I have a specific scenario that I could speak to, which was a firm that did extremely well their first year, did like 800K in revenue their first year in business, and was, closing deals, having all kinds of success. And then, the founder was still sort of straddling delivery and sales. And so got pulled into the weeds on delivery and then kind of took his eye off the ball on sales. And this person went through a sales drought and got to this place where they were like, we are out of money. There's no more cash in the bank account, and I still have 4 months worth of work left to do. Right. And so while they were pulling, lots of profit and distributions out of the business throughout that whole first year, because they on their P&L every month, they would be like, oh, I've got $50,000 in profit. I've got $60,000 in profit. What that was cash from the newest deal that we hadn't incurred the cost of doing the work yet. And they hadn't taken this like truly accrual lens. They didn't have an understanding of their direct delivery margins, and it all kind of caught up to them in the end. And so again, it was like this trap of cash flow creating the illusion of profitability when fundamentally the profitability wasn't there, because they weren't taking into account the reality of what it was going to cost them to earn that revenue and the difference in timing between when that cash would land in their bank account and when they would have to pay the people to do the work.
Yep. Yeah, it's sort of the analogy I kind of give. It's almost like the opposite of like the flip side of that is how people use credit cards, right? Like if you've got $0 in the bank and you're still racking up bills on your credit card, that you are assuming that the cash will come in when the bill comes due to pay. It's like, well, technically you're spending tomorrow's dollars.
Right.
And that's how a lot of people will take their distributions as well. I'm taking tomorrow's dollars in distributions.
Yeah. And this is like, you could look at this as an accounting problem, but that's still fairly retroactive. I mean, part of this is just like, again, having an understanding of your direct delivery margin. So that's an important one. But kind of coming back to the question, let's assume that that's not the case. You do have decent direct delivery margins on ongoing work, but they're kind of crappy up front. What do you do about that situation? And at the end of the day, I think you have to come back to your three levers. So we've talked about two of them, which is average billable rate, utilization, and the third one is average cost per hour, which we haven't really touched on, but I think is important,
Mm-hmm.
which is, in average billable rate, we talked about spending less time to increase your efficiency. The other side of that is to say, well, maybe we'll spend the same amount of time, but we can have less expensive people doing that work. And that's often a function of how do we invest in processes, technology, SOPs, documentation, whatever, to lower the level of judgment required to get something done. And I find that, especially in a lot of big consulting firms, they tend to underinvest in process, and therefore they have to rely on very senior people to do a lot of things that are below their pay grade, just because the lack of context and the lack of clarity that is within their control is so large that it does require a lot more experience to get these things done, just because it's not very clear how it gets done. So that's another important opportunity. And then if we're in this situation where it's like, okay, our business model no longer works because our direct delivery margins are not as good as they used to be, those are the three levers you have to pay attention to. So can we reevaluate these initial engagements to either increase the average billable rate by charging more, or in this case, assuming that we're price constrained, getting more efficient or lowering the average cost per hour of that engagement? Or is there a way that we can restructure our team so our utilization rate can be higher? We can earn more revenue without taking on more people. And a lot of that might be, how do we resource projects? How do we get people spending less time on administrative things and get more of those things off of their plate? Right. Those are essentially the three things that I'd be paying attention to try and
Yeah.
fundamentally improve the model of the business in that scenario. Yeah.
Yep. There's an interesting thing. We got a little bit of time left here that might be fun to talk about, which is the change that's happening in the consulting industry. We're seeing it in agency space too, I think. But it's this idea of like AI is killing the practice, if you will, of consulting or of agencies. And I'm not by any means advocating that, but I think there's something interesting to it, which is, like what you described, historically has been the model of the big firms, which is we're going to have this pyramid of, some high powered partners up top, maybe a couple of junior partners, and then just an F ton of associates. They're going to do all the grunt work and, whatever, that's been kind of the gripe with big firm consulting. It's like I know that the partner is going to come in and make the sale. I'm never going to see that person again until once the work is being actually delivered. It's going to be all these junior people who have no idea who the hell they are, right? That's been sort of the negative part of that. That does seem to be changing a bit with what AI and automation are allowing people to do. Again, I'm not the person that's out there going, yeah, it's killing the hourly model or whatever. Like, I think that's like alarmist, and to a certain extent, I think there's some truth to it, but I think the way people are describing it is not exactly true. But I'd love to just maybe just riff on that for a bit. What are your thoughts on kind of that scenario, if you will, of what's going on right now?
Yeah, I think that it's the same as every other platform shift that we've had. You could go back to the Industrial Revolution, for Christ's sake. I mean, the internet, these are all, to me, the same thing, which is there are a bunch of problems that used to be really hard to solve prior to those platform shifts that are not hard to solve anymore. There were businesses that made money solving those problems that no longer exist. And there's also even more businesses that are solving new problems that didn't exist prior to the platform shift.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing's happening with AI. I can tell you who's not struggling right now: firms that are selling AI shit to big enterprise companies. They're doing fine.
Yep.
They're doing just fine.
Yep.
And who is struggling is people who used to charge $100,000 for something that deep research on Google Gemini can do just as well in 6 minutes. Right? So like there are,
or like 80, even if it's 80% of the way there, right?
Right.
Like
The value,
$20 a month versus $100,000. Yeah.
the value difference there is just like the
Yeah.
differential is insane. And so here's what I fundamentally believe, Mike, is that there is no better medium for solving problems than the service business model. That's the reason that like a third of the economy is made up of service-based businesses. It's the reason it's been the most durable business model in human history. And it's the reason I believe that you will not be able to kill it. It's like a cockroach, because as the tectonic plates of, what's happening at a macro level, AI, the internet, quantum computing, space, as all of these things change, there will always be cracks forming, and services are the most malleable medium in business to
Yeah.
go fill those cracks. And so the firms that are positioned to or able to adapt to where the cracks are
Yeah.
forming will survive, and the ones that don't will fall through. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just sort of, I think, the natural cycle of things. The difference is the speed at which these changes happen is getting greater and greater and greater. Where the industrial revolution was expressed in decades, and the internet was also
Yeah.
expressed in, like fewer decades, but still like 10 years before things really started to change. Now, I mean, we're talking like from 2019 to now, like look at what's happened with AI. It went from not existing to like it's literally taken businesses down. And so I think it's just the pace of evolution that is creating a sense that this is like different. And I don't think it's different. I think it's just faster
Yeah.
and more extreme.
Yep. Yeah, and I think what I've been advising folks is I think you have to look at things like nuance matters in these types of. I mean, I think nuance matters everywhere, but definitely in these types of scenarios and decisions that need to be made. And I think it's important to look at whether the service that you're offering and the industry that you're offering it in, whether demand is static or whether there's room for growth. Meaning, like, and again, I don't know if this is the best example, but like, there was a comment about this whole thing about like law firms. I'm like, well, this might not be the best way to look at it, because it's like, well, for example, are more people going to, like, are firms going to take on more cases because they can take them on cheaper through deep research and whatever else? They don't need to pay a bunch of paralegals for, stuff or whatever it is. Like, um, and then if that is true, are more people going to file cases and sue other people and companies because it is less expensive than it used to be? And that changes the entire scope of, or the entire landscape of demand, right? Versus whatever, take CPAs. Well, you either need to file your tax return or you don't.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, that's fairly static.
And this is where I think, especially in when you look at most consulting, most creative disciplines, like this is white collar stuff, and it's not tangible. It's not tied to human life or planetary life. And if
Yeah.
we look historically, I think this is such a good point, Michael, because that's where a lot of the sort of catastrophization of this situation is going on, is thinking it's zero sum. So whatever the demand is for what we're doing right now, it's
Yeah.
static. And if AI makes it more efficient, then there's just less for everybody. But in human
Yeah.
history, when we look at the industrial revolution and the internet, we had the choice at most of those instances to do more, consume more, produce more, or do the same amount we were doing before for less. And we've always chosen to do more. It's human nature. And so I
Mm-hmm.
agree that I think what's being discounted here is the increase in volume
Yeah.
that will come as a result of the increase in productivity.
Yeah. I think you're giving the alarmists too much credit, Marcel. I think most of them don't even think about it at all. So,
Fair.
but yeah, 100%. So one other thing that might be, get a couple of minutes. By the way, if anyone else that's still on has questions, throw them in the chat, or either on LinkedIn or in the stream if you're there live. We'll see if we can answer those. And then one other thing that might be fun to just riff on for a minute is, we're kind of talking before we jumped on, is there seems to be this interesting dichotomy of consulting firm owners, and again, this is a generalization for sure, versus agency firm owners. And again, I focus definitely much more on the consulting side. I would say your business is more on the agency side, but we both cross the other direction. And what I tend to see is this like weird thing where agency owners almost wear like bad profitability, like net margin as like a badge of honor, versus consulting firm founders tend to go the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just an interesting observation, I guess. And I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we chatted a little bit about this prior to the recording, and so I'll preface my answer by saying that this is not based on any kind of like objective data or research, and I'm about to
Yes.
essentially paint a large demographic with a sweeping generalization. But generally speaking, people that start creative firms are creatives that come from a creative background. And that's a demographic and a culture where, it's the starving artist. There's generally an inverse correlation in the perception of wealth and morality, right? So this idea that like the richer you are, and to some degree, if you get too rich, like that is inversely correlated with morality. You're likely a bad person. And I don't know that that belief is as pervasive, in the types of individuals that tend to start consulting firms and other, consulting disciplines that tend to come from corporate America, or tend to come from more of a professional discipline background, like accounting, finance, legal, those kinds of things. And so, my guess is that that is just sort of the culture of the kind of interest and profession that they come from, maybe having some kind of psychological influence. And I think it would be really fascinating to study that actually and get some objective data around it, because I'd be curious as to how much that's actually subconsciously influencing decision making on a day-to-day basis around things like pricing and around things like, you know, letting people go or keeping expenses low, or some of these little, well, seemingly little, but these important decisions that over the course of years can be really, really meaningful in terms of what kind of financial return a person gets from their time in the business.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely tell you from personal experience, it definitely impacts it, for sure, right? Because like for me at least, it did, where there were difficult decisions that we just put off for much longer than we should have in hindsight, right? Again, I'm an N of one, but I definitely see that a lot. And I'll see comments from agency owners, things like, "Hey, we brought in like 1.5 million last year, and I only took home 40,000." It's like, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, part of that too might be that, for better or for worse, a lot of artists have a relationship with their work that
Yeah,
is very different than a consultant. Like I don't know a lot of accountants that see their work as art, but I know a lot of designers that see their
yeah,
work as art, and so that can change
yeah,
the relationship where it's like, it's more about the art than it is about the money, and that ends up being
yeah,
reflected in sometimes the kind of financial outcomes that occur there.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
So
Well, Marcel, this has been fun. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we can wrap up.
good.
It's a good place to stop. So thank you for your time. It's been a fun conversation. Folks, definitely take Marcel up on his offer of using his free resources. They're pretty awesome. They're Marcel, I'm assuming they're on the Parakeeta website, or
They
they can
are.
find them through your LinkedIn profile.
Yep, parakeeto.com/toolkit, or
Yeah,
just send me a DM. I'm always happy to be helpful,
yeah,
point you to the right stuff.
awesome, awesome. All right, Marcel, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you on the next Consulting Growth Insights Live.
Thanks, Mike.